Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 2 of our story tonight. So before we continue with our story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and also go and get yourself a lovely drink, something refreshing. And let's get started with part 2 of our story tonight. Back at home, it was a seemingly routine day for Melinda's mother, Nancy, but a special day at that, for she was enjoying the responsibility of taking charge over her precious grandson, Keegan. She worried that her grandson's poor health, with all the issues he was having with colic, would give her some tempestuous challenges, as looking after a colicky baby is no walk in the park. Keegan, when he became upset, cried very badly, and indeed he was so loud he'd have lightly raised the sleeping dead. Thankfully he hadn't given her too many issues that morning, but Nancy was somewhat surprised that Melinda hadn't been calling her 100 times a day, asking her how little Keegan was doing. But that was a good thing. It meant her daughter must be settling down at work, managing the affairs of her salon, and not brooding over her baby boy. Nancy had worried profusely about Melinda's return to work, for she knew her daughter was extremely attached to little Keegan, and had really looked very upset about abandoning him to go to work, especially since Keegan suffered from colic and couldn't stop crying for hours on end. He was failing to thrive and was significantly underweight. Nancy knew it was likely that her daughter was feeling like every mother feels about leaving their baby in someone else's charge, even if it is their grandmother. Especially a baby going through some health challenges, like Keegan was at the time. It was a magnificent day. The golden sun shone brightly outside. It was early spring, when the world invited you to spend some quality time out of doors. So Nancy thought, why not embrace the occasion, especially with little Keegan being so sickly at the moment. Some indirect sunshine and fresh air might do him the world of good. At the time, Nancy was knitting her grandson a little woolly jacket, and so she decided to place little Keegan in the portable cot, which she strategically placed on the porch. She decided to sit back comfortably on one of the cushioned Adirondack chairs while she began to knit. Little Keegan was thankfully fast asleep, but likely he'd cry like mad when he became hungry, and when he did, Nancy would know all about it, as Keegan could wail the house down for hours on end when he wanted to feed, and sometimes you didn't know what he was crying about, but that was colic for you. It was a mysterious illness. Nancy was sure she knew the sounds that Keegan made when he wanted his nappy changing, and when he wanted to feed, so she believed she was in tune with her grandson's biorhythm, so to speak. Nancy was tuned into a radio station that she regularly enjoyed listening to, where the host was talking about how to make the perfect cheesecake. People began phoning into the station to explain the things that had gone badly wrong while making theirs. Nancy was a keen cook, so she was interested in gaining as many tips as possible to improve her cooking skills, so her ears were attentive to any advice that might potentially serve her well. Nancy was enjoying the feel of the warm sunshine on her skin, as well as the beguiling views that overlooked the spacious backyard that was heavily fringed by burgeoning woodgroves of majestic but tall, lofty trees. What a lovely afternoon it was, she thought. But as she looked towards the groves of trees, she couldn't shake off the ominous feeling that someone was watching her. She wondered if perhaps she was losing her mind. It was an uncomfortable sense of foreboding that overcame her, but she told herself she was being silly, overreacting perhaps. The radio continued with its long monologue, an in-depth discussion about how to make the perfect cheesecake. Who doesn't love the perfect cheesecake? I'm sure all you listeners do. Me personally, I love cheesecake, said the host. And these days there are so many favourites out there. From pecan nut to chocolate truffle, lemon meringue, strawberry, the list goes on. The main thing you need to focus on for a perfect cheesecake is temperature. Every time it's about temperature. You want an even temperature in your oven, and you don't want it to be too hot. The best way for an even temperature is to cook your cheesecake in a bain-marie. Now, the word bain-marie is another word for water bath. You need to put your cheesecake in a pan of water and cover it with thick foil to ensure that no water from the water bath seeps into the tin. When the cheesecake is finally set and firm to the touch, with a little wobble in the middle, turn off the oven and leave it to set for an hour or so before removing it from the oven, where you can let it cool down for another hour, after which you refrigerate for about 24 hours before eating. Nancy began to make some mental notes about the secrets to making a very good cheesecake, but suddenly she began to feel so exhausted. It was as if she was suddenly overcome with a tiredness she couldn't fight. One eyelid began to droop, followed by the other. Her fingers loosened and relaxed, so that her knitting, the ball of wool along with the knitting needles, fell on the floor and went flying towards Genevieve the cat, who happened to be relaxing on the patio, and who began to rambunctiously play with the wool, tugging it furiously with his sharp claws, as if it was the most wonderful game. Slowly but surely a slow snore came out of Nancy's mouth. Her head shifted to one slanted angle, dropping over her shoulders, and then she was gone to the world, transported from the patio to a mystical realm you can only ever visit when you're in deep sleep. She didn't know that while she slept and soaked up the sunshine, baby Keegan was gurgling happily in his cot. He was being nursed in the arms of another. She didn't see his face light up like a Christmas tree as he was swept out of his cot and cuddled and nurtured by the stranger, who rocked him gently against her snug, sturdy chest, while he feasted greedily on a teat that delivered for him the warmest, richest milk he'd ever tasted. Nancy's sleep was both tranquil and deep. She didn't know she was in the presence of a stranger, nor did she know that Genevieve, her cat, rather alarmed by their unorthodox visitor, had abandoned the ball of wool that she'd practically wrecked with her sharp claws, so that Nancy's knitting was lying on the ground, having lost all its stitches in a tangled mess that could not be corrected. Nancy continued to sleep unapologetically on the Adirondack chair, as if it was the most comfortable mattress lying beneath her. Her sleep was wonderful, so sweet, her dreams so colourful. The afternoon happily chugged along, like a slow-moving train, making its way to a far-off destination. It was the sound of Nancy's cell phone that rang so abruptly that shook her out of her sleep rather violently, so she jumped up with a start, almost as if she'd just had a very sudden electric shock. She felt bemused, disorientated, and somewhat confused, wondering where on earth she was. She realized she was sitting on the Adirondack chair on the porch, her knitting lying on the floor in a tangled mess. Little Keegan was lying fast asleep in his cot, his eyes shut, his heart beating to a slow, energetic rhythm, so the white onesie he was wearing was going up and down in the chest area. He looked so calm, so serene, so much more so than he normally did, for he was usually sickly, but right now his skin had taken on a rosy glow. She hadn't heard a sound from him during what had seemed like a brief siesta. This was very unusual, for when Keegan woke up, he could scream and scream for hours on end, for no earthly reason at all. But he hadn't woken her up at all. She glanced at the cell phone that kept ringing. She could see it was Melinda's name on the caller ID. She quickly glanced at the time and almost had a heart attack. It was 4:30. She couldn't believe it. What had happened to the whole afternoon? How long had she been asleep for? She almost felt annoyed for being rudely awoken by her daughter, for it was hard to get her bearings. But she hurriedly grabbed the phone and answered it quickly, trying to sound as if she was wide awake and alert, when in truth she was anything but. "Hello, darling. How's your day going?" "Mum, thank God you answered. You took your time answering. Is everything all right?" "Yes, of course it is, love. Everything's fine around here. Keegan and I have been enjoying a little sunshine on the porch. It's a pleasant afternoon, isn't it, dear?" "I wouldn't know anything about that, Mum. I've been indoors all the time, run off my feet all afternoon. You have no idea how chaotic it was returning to the salon after leaving Kirsty Rawlings in charge. She left the place in quite the state, you know. I've had to deal with so many complaints from customers. It's been hell, but thank God she walked out on me, so I didn't have to give her the sack. Would you believe it seems her attention has been diverted to a new fancy man in her life, a boyfriend I rather suspect who she's been seeing. She denies it, of course, but everybody knows differently. She more or less allowed the salon to go to seed. It seems I got back to work in the nick of time. Why is it, Mum, so impossibly hard to delegate responsibilities to other people when they keep letting you down like this? Well, it sounds as if you've had one hell of a day, darling, and that's not good on your first day back. You don't need all this stress. You poor thing. It can't have been an easy afternoon for you. You don't know the half of it, Mum. I'll spare you all the grisly details. I meant to phone you a lot earlier on, but with Kirsty's messes that I had to fix, and all these clients I had to pacify, well, I didn't have the opportunity, did I? I barely have given Keegan a second thought, I'm ashamed to admit. Well, I think that's a good thing, love. The last thing you want to be is worrying about Keegan when you're at work. I assure you he's in very safe hands with his grandmother. Of course he's in safe hands with you, Mum. He's a lucky boy, but I'm a mother, so I worry, don't I? Especially with him being so colicky. I just worry about him being so underweight, and always looking so desperately pale. Of course you worry, love. It's a mother's prerogative. I did it when you were little. But it's funny you should talk about him being so pale, because right now he looks anything but. His cheeks are quite rosy this afternoon. I've never seen anything like it before. I think lying in his cot on the patio has done him the world of good. I need to do this more often. I'll see you later. After her call with her daughter, Nancy picked up her grandson and swaddled him gently in her arms. He gurgled happily, and she wondered why he hadn't been howling for food, or why he hadn't cried non-stop, because surely, by now, he must have soiled himself, and possibly needed his nappy changing. He seemed so bright, so contented and so alert, and she'd never seen him this way before. He wasn't showing any signs of colic, but just appeared completely content. She decided to take him for a nappy change in the nursery, but was astonished to find that although his onesie was in place, it looked as if the press studs at the bottom had been badly disaligned. The most bizarre thing of all was that on his bottom half he didn't appear to be wearing a nappy. I thought I put a nappy on him when I gave him his nappy change, she told herself. But he's not wearing one. Nancy was beginning to second-guess herself. She knew when you changed a nappy, you did so instinctively, so she couldn't remember the last time when she changed his nappy. But given she was the only one around little Keegan at the moment, she must have absent-mindedly put on his onesie and forgotten to replace his nappy. But he was clean, and it appeared as if he hadn't soiled himself at all, which in itself was astounding. She didn't know what to make of it all. It had been a long time since Keegan had had any sustenance, so she decided to warm up some breast milk that Melinda had left in the refrigerator for her baby boy. But Keegan showed no interest in eating. He appeared to have no appetite. He was gurgling happily and staring at Nancy with wide twinkling eyes. He looked so serene, so contented, she couldn't get over it. He looked the epitome of a healthy baby boy. But why wasn't he hungry? Nancy was concerned about Keegan's lack of interest in his mother's warmed-up breast milk. But there was nothing about him that suggested he was remotely sickly. On the contrary, he continued to look as sharp as a button. Nancy decided she wouldn't say anything to her daughter about what had just transpired, for Melinda would be horrified that she'd fallen asleep for so long on the patio while supervising her grandson's needs. And if she had doubts about Nancy's ability to look after baby Keegan, their living arrangements would go pear-shaped. I'm making such a big deal about this, Nancy reprimanded herself. All right, I fell asleep, I admit that. Big deal, it happens to people. I forgot to put on Keegan's nappy, but his onesie didn't get soiled, which was miraculous in itself, and he doesn't appear to have any appetite. But that does not matter. It was so good for him to be on the patio. His face is glowing. He's showing no signs of being poorly. There's colour in his cheeks, and I haven't seen that for a long time. It looks as if his colic has gone. He hasn't cried at all. I've got absolutely nothing to worry about." The following morning, Melinda was the first one to get up in the Stratton household. It was early. The dawn hadn't broken yet, but there was a lot that needed to be done. She efficiently pumped some breast milk out for baby Keegan, surprised to find an excess of breast milk remaining in the refrigerator from the previous day, which in itself was decidedly odd, but she didn't think too much about it. Maybe baby Keegan had not been that hungry yesterday. Nancy fed Keegan while she rocked him in her arms, and he chuckled and gurgled happily. He appeared hungry, and suckled her breast appreciatively. She gave him a quick nappy change, and was amazed to see how badly soiled his nappy was, which did indeed suggest he probably had a healthy appetite after all, so it didn't explain why there was an excess of extra breast milk in the refrigerator. The previous night Keegan had slept soundly, and Melinda had enjoyed the first night of being undisturbed, which in itself was miraculous, for that had not happened before, and her mother was right. Keegan's skin had a rosy glow to it, and her baby looked so much more calm and content, and there was no signs of any colic last night, for he hadn't cried at all. She placed him in a yellow onesie and put him back in the cot, twisting the mobile for a while so that the little fish darted above Keegan's head, while playing a pretty nursery rhyme. Little Keegan chuckled with delight, his arms trying to reach for the fish. Melinda discreetly left the nursery to join her mother in the kitchen for a much-needed cup of coffee before embarking on her morning run. Nancy was dressed in a pink dressing gown, her hair flat on one side, her eyes congealed with sleep, as if she hadn't quite woken up yet, and was somewhat disorientated. Nancy glanced at her daughter, noticing that she was kitted out in her jogging gear. "You're going for a jog, are you?" she asked. "What does it look like?" said Nancy with a bright smile. "Don't look so surprised, Mum. I want to get fit, don't I? I need to lose some of this baby weight." "Well, you are enterprising, I'll give you that, love. Going out for some early morning exercise before work. Good on you, that's what I say." "Well, believe it or not, Mum, despite the fact I desperately need to get into shape after having baby Keegan, I also find that exercise de-stresses me before work. It makes the day go by more smoothly, and believe you, I'm going to need that." "Well, go and enjoy your run then. I'll take my coffee into the nursery and watch over Keegan for you." "Oh, Mum, I forgot to mention, it's very important that every afternoon, if the weather is warm, to let Keegan lie on the porch in his cot. You did it yesterday, and you're right. He's looking so much better. He's exhibiting no signs of colic, and there's a glow to his face. I've never seen him so contented, and last night he didn't wake us up once. So I think putting him outdoors is a good thing, because it seems that it's actually made him so much healthier. You could also take him for a walk in the woods once in a while in the stroller. And I think that him having some sunshine, well, I think it's doing him good." "But of course it's doing him good. I'll definitely take him for a walk in a stroller at some point. I will adopt the same routine every afternoon like I did yesterday, so that Keegan gets to enjoy some sunshine on the porch. Now off with you. Go and have that jog, and quit worrying about your boy." Melinda was exceedingly grateful to finally be out of the house. It was early morning, and she hadn't gone running for a long time, so this was a first for her. The sunshine had broken through the clouds, casting its cheerful glaze all over the yard and the woodland oasis that stretched out before her like an unexplored map. It was all so warmly welcoming. Melinda couldn't help thinking very fondly of her late father, how much she missed him, how she wished he was here right now. She was reminded of him as she happily ran down these woodland trails, for this is where he'd walk every morning. She was glad she was not pounding the streets in town with her sneakers beating hard against the tarmac, which is what she'd have been doing if she'd been living at the apartment, and that couldn't have been desperately good on her joints. If the truth be told, she was very glad to be living back at home with her beloved mother, and let's just say her mother's help with Keegan had been invaluable to date. But it was such a dreadful pity her father was no longer alive. He'd have loved to see little Keegan grow up into a young man. And ironically, Keegan bore an uncanny resemblance to her father when he was a boy. At least she knew she could go to work at the salon, knowing that Keegan was safe and well in her mother's charge. And by all accounts, her mother did seem to have a magical touch with little Keegan, for there was no doubt he looked incredibly well. There was a rosiness to his cheeks. He looked as if he'd put on weight, and last night he hadn't even woken them up at all. It was almost miraculous, as if the colic had all but disappeared. But she wouldn't get her hopes up, not yet anyway. As she ran through the woodgrove, her sneakers beat the soft ground beneath them. She felt energized and curiously happy, but her thoughts strayed off to the many issues at the salon and the dramas that had recently unfolded while she'd been away from work. She felt frustrated that she'd never found anyone capable enough to delegate responsibilities to, for no one cared about her business as passionately as she did, and that was obvious. But then again, wasn't that inevitable to anyone who ran their own business? She had started the business from scratch 6 years earlier, and had worked herself to the bone to make it succeed, so she was still feeling very aggrieved about the mayhem that she had returned to after a short leave of absence. The woodgrove was beautiful in the early morning sun. Everything was covered in the silvery glaze of freshly fallen dew that seemed to twinkle in the morning light, and all the spider webs hanging between the tree branches looked like ethereal dream catchers. It really was truly magnificent. Some of the leaves left behind from the previous fall were lying liberally sprinkled across the earthen floor, like bridal confetti all in gold, while rambling shade-loving plants, many of them blossoming with pretty flowers, were bursting through the ground, sprinkling the woodgrove in a cacophony of pastel shades. Melinda tried to compartmentalize the things in her head that needed to be done that day. She needed to put an order in for new towels at the salon. The old ones needed prompt replacing. They weren't as fluffy as they used to be. An image was everything in an up-and-coming salon. She also needed to order more stock for customers to purchase, as she sold a vast range of top-of-the-range products her clients liked to use. She was going to see a new supplier today for nail varnishes, for the salon was introducing a new range of products, including a more sophisticated form of acrylic nails that had just come onto the market. She also needed to have a long talk with Angie about being fastidious about sweeping up clients' hair after a haircut. All of a sudden her thoughts were rudely interrupted by a cough. But where exactly had it come from? She couldn't be sure. She had heard a cough, hadn't she? She was sure she had. Was there someone on their property, she wondered? She stopped for a second and looked around herself rather nervously. "Hello," she called out into the woods. "Hello, is anybody there?" Her voice came back to her in an echo. But the woodgrove remained quiet. There was no answer. "Hello, is anybody there? Hello? Hello? Who coughed? Who made that sound?" The woodgrove remained as composed and as dignified as a ballet dancer. The only movement came from a slight breeze that whispered through the trees, and Melinda was sure she must have imagined the cough. She continued to jog, but couldn't shake off the ominous feeling that someone was watching her. Indeed, it was so palpable, it was almost as if someone had physically touched her on the shoulder. Once again she stopped dead in her tracks and looked around herself, but nothing was there. "What are you like?" she told herself, jogging straight back to the house to get on with her day. She did not see the tall, shadowy figure watching her curiously from behind a tree. She didn't hear the second cough in the woodgrove that may have made her all the more certain that someone was definitely there. Once Melinda had rushed off to work in her usual last-minute panic, the house breathed a huge sigh of relief when all the stress had left the house in what seemed like a whisk of smoke, as there was no doubt the weight of Melinda returning to work had invited a great deal of tension into the Stratton household, rather like an unwelcome guest that you really didn't want hanging around for terribly long. Melinda's mother Nancy worried about Melinda taking her business far too seriously. When she'd returned home after work, on her first day, and especially after her fiasco with Kirsty and some disenchanted clients, she had looked as flustered as a chicken that had been attacked by a fox in its coop. So Nancy had done her level best to calm down her daughter. She had run a hot bath for Melinda, filling it with lovely essential oils such as bergamot and lavender, designed to both bring balance and relaxation to the body. Later that evening, mother and daughter had shared a bottle of wine together and enjoyed a good movie, while Keegan, against all the odds, slept peacefully in the nursery, which had been a first. It would seem after a hectic day at work. Finally Nancy had helped her daughter relax a little, but she was well aware that life was never easy for a working mum. It would be a long while before her daughter learned how to juggle motherhood with running her business, but she'd get the hang of it sooner or later. Nancy decided she would do her best to get on with her day, starting off by doing some household chores. Later she'd make a squidgy butter cake in the kitchen, which was Melinda's absolute favourite, and would lightly lift her spirits after a hard day spent at the salon. A squidgy butter cake, with its meringue-like texture and delicious sweetness, would wipe away stress with just one bite. Nancy decided to leave the squidgy cake cooling in its tin underneath a tea towel on the Adirondack table on the porch. She continued on with her day, making sure that whatever she did she supervised Keegan's every need. But the baby boy barely cried at all morning, even after he'd soiled his nappy, and Nancy was baffled by how serene her grandson had become. If he carried on this way, it would be safe to assume the colic had all but gone. Finally, when Nancy believed the gooey butter cake was cool, she brought the tin in, covered with a tea towel, leaving it on the kitchen counter, where she'd attend to it later. She knew that Melinda had especially requested her mother to bring out little Keegan onto the porch in the afternoon, to enjoy some fresh air and sunshine. Nancy was determined that this time she would not fall asleep. She couldn't let that happen 2 days in a row, for if she carried on this way she'd feel like an irresponsible grandmother. Nancy changed Keegan's nappy, putting him in a brand new onesie, and then she carried him out onto the porch, where she placed him in the portable cot, which was permanently left on the patio, for little Keegan so that he could thoroughly enjoy the pretty views of the natural world, as Melinda believed all babies, no matter what age they were, needed stimulation and a little fresh air and sunshine. After Nancy had settled little Keegan in his cot, with a soft blanket, she then sat down on the Adirondack chair, determined not to get too comfortable. She didn't want a repeat of yesterday, as the last thing she wanted to do was to fall asleep yet again. But she had a horrible feeling in her gut that history might be about to repeat itself. "I'm not tired," she kept telling herself firmly, "so there's no reason for me to fall asleep. And even if I do, Keegan will lightly scream the place down when he wants a feed. Not that he's been doing that lately." She was somewhat annoyed that Genevieve had vandalized her knitting the previous day. There was no point in trying to untangle the mess, so she decided to start all over again and cast on some new stitches. "Oh, no, you don't, Genevieve," she chuckled, as she observed Genevieve lying in a pool of sunshine on the wooden deck, her paw happily splayed out, her yellow eyes pinned directly on Nancy's ball of wool, almost as if she was waiting to have another good go at it again. Genevieve was a playful cat by nature, and unfortunately one of the couches in the living room was testimony to this fact, for that once expensive couch that had cost a pretty penny had been shredded to pieces by Genevieve's claws. She had thought it had made the perfect scratching post, but it seemed she had decided that Nancy's ball of wool also made for a very fine toy. "You're not going to touch my knitting today, Genevieve. I'm sorry, but you're not," said Nancy warningly. "I can't trust you with my knitting." Genevieve stretched out her long, sleek, silvery body, rolled over onto her back, exposing her soft, fluffy, white underbelly. She began to purr profusely, as if the reprimand she had received from her owner had put her in a very good mood, for as far as Genevieve was concerned, no matter what tone of voice Nancy used, she always appreciated attention of any kind, as all attention, whether good or bad, was always appreciated. Nancy cast on her stitches and began to knit rather vigorously. She wanted to make a lovely little white woolly jacket and matching hat for little Keegan, which he could wear when the weather got significantly colder, and he was a wee bit bigger, of course. She really was a dab hand with a pair of knitting needles, and when Melinda had been a baby, she had practically made all her cute woolly outfits for her. All of a sudden, Nancy felt a chill running down her spine. It was an airy feeling that overcame her, And then she realized what it was. Something appeared to be watching her. She felt sure of it. She glanced briefly towards the tall line of trees that fringed the woodgrove, and that was when very suddenly she observed a lofty, dark, shadowy figure standing behind one of the trees, looking directly at her through what appeared to be dark, curious eyes. The very large humanoid figure was so obscure, so incredibly vague, that Nancy couldn't make it out. She couldn't understand what she was seeing, but the feeling of being watched by this shadowy being was so tangible, rather like an itch you need to scratch. Nancy wasn't wearing her spectacles for her long-distance vision, so she reached for her glass case that was lying on the Adirondack table and retrieved her glasses, replacing them on her eyes and looking towards the woods again. At this point, those vital seconds had cost her dearly, for the indistinct figure that she couldn't make out was all but gone, and she wondered if she was possibly losing her mind, or if she'd actually seen anything at all. It might have been a trick of the light, she told herself, returning to her knitting, feeling ever so slightly flustered, for there was another big part of herself that thought she had seen something, but then she couldn't be sure. So her burgeoning doubt won her over, assuring her that nothing had been there at all. Ostensibly her distant sight left a lot to be desired. Sometimes she mistook people for postboxes and bin bags for dogs. She'd get her visual wires badly twisted, which was why Melinda was constantly telling her to wear her glasses, as without them she was as blind as a bat. But Nancy never felt comfortable wearing eyeglasses. She'd even attempted wearing contacts at one stage, but that in itself had also been a catastrophic disaster. So she put up with being blind most of her life. Nancy could feel her eyes growing heavy. She let out a sizable yawn, and was once again overcome with exhaustion. "Not this again! I can't possibly fall asleep again! What is wrong with me? I did this yesterday. I don't intend to do it today. Melinda would not be remotely happy with me. I need to stay awake for Keegan, to be able to attend to his every need." But she couldn't fight against the tsunami of tiredness which was all-consuming, almost as if an anaesthetist had struck his needle into her arm, so that she was involuntarily dropping off to sleep at the count of 3, and there was nothing she could do to fight against its indomitable hold over her. Moments later her head slumped to one side, her mouth dropped open, and she began to lightly snore. The ball of wool and her knitting fell to the ground. It was jerked off her lap. Genevieve, on seeing the ball of wool spinning towards her, was absolutely delighted, and bounced up enthusiastically from her sleeping position to catch it, and ebulliently tore into the ball of wool with her predatory nails, and Nancy's knitting was once again under savage attack. So there we are, that's the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.